Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Research Podcast.
Great to be here.
We've got quite a pile of sources laid out today. We're talking articles from places like CNN, Reuters, CBS News,
Hmm.
and also a really key interview transcript from CBN News.
Right, a good mix.
And we're going to do what we do best, a real deep dive into these materials. We want to get a hander on some pretty significant developments unfolding in the Middle East right now.
Oh.
Big stuff.
Absolutely. And when you look through this stack, there's one core event that really jumps out, kind of ties it all together.
What's that?
It's the U.S. government's decision just this week to actually move some personnel out of the region.
Okay.
The reports are pretty specific, pinpointing Wednesday, June 11th, 2025, as the day this really kicked off.
Right, June 11th. And that, I guess, is the big question these sources help us explore. Why? Why now?
Exactly.
What are the specific reasons, the underlying tensions that are pushing this decision? And maybe even bigger, what does moving people actually tell us about what's happening on the ground? Especially with Iran and Israel.
Yeah.
That whole dynamic.
Yeah, the diplomatic angle, too. What does it signal?
So that's our mission today, right? Using these articles, this interview, we want to get past the quick headlines.
Definitely. We need to pull out the crucial bits of information, what officials are actually saying on the record,
Right.
what the intelligence reports are apparently hinting at, according to these sources.
And what the experts, like the ones in that CBN interview, are flagging as the really critical points.
We want to give you, the listener, a clearer picture, something more nuanced, because honestly, it's incredibly complex over there, potentially volatile, too.
Without just getting swamped by all the noise and the, sometimes conflicting reports.
Precisely. Let's try and cut through that.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start unpacking.
Uh,
So, the immediate thing, the action that got everyone's attention this week.
Mhm.
The U.S. government making actual moves, adjusting its footprint, you could say, in certain parts of the Middle East.
Yeah.
Walk us through exactly what went down based on what these sources are telling us.
Okay, so the sources detail actions from two main branches of the U.S. government. You've got the State Department and the Defense Department, both making moves on the same day, that Wednesday, June 11th.
Okay, state and defense. What did state do?
State's action was about arranging, or in some places, actually ordering the departure of personnel they classify as non-essential.
Non-essential. So,
Yeah.
embassy staff, consulate staff,
Yeah,
people whose jobs maybe aren't critical for just keeping the lights on during a crisis?
that's basically it. Yeah. Staff whose roles aren't considered absolutely vital for maintaining minimum operations if things get, well, risky.
Got it. Diplomatic staff. What about the military side, the Defense Department?
Their move was a bit different. They authorized a departure, but it was voluntary
Voluntary, okay. For who?
for military dependents. So families of service members stationed across the Middle East.
Ah, okay. So not an order for them to leave, but basically giving families the green light, the option to leave if they felt worried about the situation.
Exactly that, if they felt it was necessary given how things were developing.
Okay, so let's clarify. Ordered departure for some civilian staff, voluntary departure for military families. Where specifically were these ordered departures happening? For the non-essential embassy or consulate folks?
The sources list specific locations based on those official notifications. The ordered departures for non-essential personnel hit the U.S. embassies in Iraq,
Okay.
Bahrain, and Kuwait.
Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, any others?
Yes, also the U.S. consulate in Erbil, that's in Iraqi Kurdistan.
Right, Erbil. So Baghdad, Manama in Bahrain, Kuwait City, and Erbil. Those are the key diplomatic posts where non-essential staff got the order to leave.
Correct.
And the voluntary departure for military families, you said, it applies broadly, but one place is more relevant.
Yeah, that's a subtle but important detail in one of the reports. I think it was Reuters. While the authorization technically covers the whole region for military dependents, a U.S. official clarified that it's, quote, mostly relevant to Bahrain.
Why Bahrain specifically?
Simply because that's where the largest concentration of U.S. military families in the Middle East actually lives.
Ah, makes sense. Naval base there, Fifth Fleet.
Exactly. The Navy's Fifth Fleet headquarters is in Bahrain, so a lot of personnel and their families are based there. So while the policy might be region-wide, the real-world impact on families is felt most acutely in Bahrain.
That really clarifies things. So targeted orders for non-essential diplomats in Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Erbil, and a voluntary option for military families, hitting Bahrain the hardest, practically speaking.
You got it.
Okay, now the big question, why? What are the official reasons given in these sources for taking these steps now?
Well, the official line, pretty consistently across the different sources we looked at, points directly at rising tensions.
Tensions. Okay.
The State Department, for example, they formally updated their worldwide travel advisory on that Wednesday, June 11th.
What did it say?
It explicitly cited heightened regional tensions as the reason for ordering the departure of non-emergency personnel from those specific posts we just listed.
Heightened regional tensions. Okay. What about defense?
Similar message. A defense official is quoted in one report saying that U.S. Central Command CENTCOM, the military command for the region, is keeping a very close eye on developing tension in the Middle East.
Developing tension. So state says heightened, defense says developing. Sounds serious. And President Trump weighed in too, right? Someone asked him directly.
They did. He was arriving for an event, I think at the Kennedy Center, also on Wednesday.
What did he say?
His comments were, well, pretty blunt. The reports quote him directly. He told the press, they're being moved out because it could be a dangerous place, and we'll see what happens.
The dangerous place.
Yeah, he added, but they have been, or we've given notice to move out, and we'll see what happens. He basically doubled down, saying Americans were advised to leave because the region could be a dangerous place.
Wow. So the message from the top is unambiguous. We're moving people because it might get dangerous due to these rising tensions.
That's the clear narrative coming from the U.S. side, state, defense, the president, all singing from the same hymn sheet on that point.
And this is fascinating. You mentioned earlier there's a counterpoint, a crucial one, coming from Iraq itself, which is one of the main places for these ordered departures.
Absolutely. And this is where you see the complexity pulling from different voices in the sources. An Iraqi government official is quoted, and pretty clearly, stating that these U.S. personnel movements had nothing to do with the security posture in his country.
Nothing to do with the security in Iraq. That's a direct contradiction, isn't it?
It seems like it on the surface, and it gets stronger. Iraq's state news agency apparently cited a government source who went even further.
What did they say?
They said Baghdad had, quote, not recorded any security indication that called for an evacuation.
Wow. So the U.S. says it's tense, potentially dangerous in places including Iraq. But an Iraqi official says, nope, our security situation here hasn't changed in a way that warrants this. How do you square that circle?
Well, it suggests a couple of things. Reading between the lines of the sources, it could just be a straightforward difference in how the U.S. and Iraqi governments are assessing the immediate threat at that specific moment.
Okay, different risk assessments.
But
possible.
And maybe this fits better when you look at the other tensions bubbling up in the sources. It could mean the threat driving the U.S. decision isn't necessarily seen as originating within Iraq. Meaning the worry isn't about, say, internal Iraqi instability suddenly spiking in Baghdad or Erbil. It's more that Iraq, because of its location and its neighbors, is seen as a potential stage or a vulnerable spot for conflict or retaliation that's actually being driven by regional tensions focused elsewhere, like between Iran and Israel, perhaps.
So the U.S. using regional tensions is key. It's broader than just Iraq's internal situation.
Exactly. The U.S. concern seems to be wider, seeing Iraq as potentially getting caught in the crossfire if those bigger regional tensions boil over.
That's a really important distinction. It's not necessarily saying Iraq itself is less safe day to day, but that it could become unsafe due to external factors.
Precisely. It's about potential spillover.
Okay. Before we dive deep into those specific regional tensions, the sources also made clear where things didn't change, right? It wasn't a blanket move across the entire Middle East.
Correct. Important context. Even though Kuwait was on the list for ordered departure of non-essential embassy staff. The U.S. Embassy in Kuwait actually put out a statement. They said they had not changed its staffing posture and remains fully operational.
That's a bit confusing. They're on the list, but they say they're fully operational.
It is a little ambiguous. It might mean the ordered departure for Kuwait was more like a strong suggestion or authorization for non-essential staff, rather than a hard mandate, like maybe it was for Iraq or Bahrain. Or maybe the risk assessment for Kuwait was just slightly different. The sources aren't perfectly clear on that specific nuance for Kuwait.
Okay, so maybe some flexibility there for Kuwait. What about Qatar? Huge U.S. military presence there, Al Udeid Air Base.
Sources are very clear on Qatar, explicitly stated no change in operations at Al Udeid, business as usual there.
Good to know. And the U.S. Embassy in Qatar.
Same story. No evacuation order for embassy employees or their families. They're reported to be operating normally too.
All right, let's recap this first part quickly then. U.S. takes specific steps, orders non-essential diplomatic staff out of Iraq, Bahrain, maybe Kuwait, and Erbil. authorizes voluntary departure for military families, mainly affecting Bahrain.
Yep.
U.S. says it's because of heightened regional tensions, potential danger. Trump confirms, uses the word dangerous. But crucially, an Iraqi official says, hold on, it's not about our internal security, suggesting the threat is seen as regional, potentially spilling into Iraq.
Right. A key disagreement there.
And meanwhile, major hubs like Al Udeid in Qatar, the embassy there, even maybe the Kuwait embassy, they're saying no change to normal operations.
Exactly. So it's a targeted move, not a full-scale bug-out, focused on places deemed vulnerable in a wider regional flare-up.
Which brings us right to the core issue, as you said. If the U.S. points to heightened regional tensions, and it's maybe not just about Iraq's internal situation, what are these specific tensions? The sources really seem to connect this directly to Iran and Israel, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Explicitly, several sources draw that line. CNN, for instance, notes these U.S. departures come as tensions involving Iran and Israel have recently escalated.
Okay.
And it's not happening in isolation. This escalation is hitting right at the same time as the Trump administration continues to pursue a new nuclear deal with Iran.
Ah. So it's a perfect storm almost. You've got the risk of actual fighting between Iran and Israel.
Layered on top of these really difficult ongoing negotiations about Iran's nuclear program.
That's the dangerous convergence the sources point to.
Yep.
Intense pressure from both sides.
Okay, let's really dig into that convergence. Let's start with the nuclear talks. They're described as stalled. What's the latest, according to these sources?
Well, the big goal for the Trump administration, stated clearly, is getting a deal that clamps down hard on Iran's nuclear ambitions.
Right, limit the program.
But the current state of those talks, the words used in the sources, tell a story. Stuttering, deadlocked, according to Reuters. CBS called them delicate. Doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. And President Trump himself, his public comments seem less hopeful than they might have been before.
Yeah, he's quoted expressing, well, growing pessimism. Said he's getting less confident about actually reaching a deal.
Less confident.
In one interview mentioned by CNN and Reuters, he apparently said, I'm getting more and more less confident about it. They seem to be delaying, and I think that's a shame, but I'm less confident now than I would have been a couple of months ago. So he feels the dynamic has shifted for the worse.
Definitely seems that way from his perspective. He even made this kind of observation about Iran's approach.
What was that?
He said something like, something happened to them, and that his instincts tell him a deal is actually moving further away now, not closer.
So he thinks Iran changed tack somehow, making things harder.
That seems to be his reading of the situation, yeah. That whatever happened, it's making a deal less likely from the U.S. standpoint.
Okay, so if talks are deadlocked and Trump's getting pessimistic, what's the actual sticking point? The fundamental disagreement that's causing the blockage?
Sources are really clear on this one. It boils down to uranium enrichment.
Enrichment, okay.
President Trump's position, as quoted, is incredibly firm, almost absolute. He says he will not accept any uranium enrichment by Iran. Full stop. Called it very simple.
Zero enrichment. That's a hard line. How does Iran react to that?
Well, according to Trump himself, Iranian leaders have basically said no deal on those terms. They won't accept zero enrichment.
Okay, so that's the impasse.
And this is where that CBN News interview with the experts from FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, adds some really important detail.
What do they say?
Jonathan Sear and Ahmad Sharawi from FDD, they explain the nuance. The core fight isn't just if Iran has a nuclear program. It's specifically about whether Tehran gets to keep a program with limited enrichment ability,
Right.
or if they have to dismantle the whole enrichment infrastructure completely.
Limited versus dismantled. Big difference.
Huge difference. And Trump's very simple stance is demanding complete dismantling, which Iran seems completely unwilling to agree to. That's the gap.
And those FDD experts, they also talked about Iran's history in negotiations and what they're capable of now, didn't they?
They did. They brought up the 2015 deal, the JCPOA. They pointed out that under that deal, Iran didn't have to fully dismantle everything. And according to reports they mentioned, Iran was apparently still doing some enrichment work in secret, undeclared places, even while getting sanctions relief.
Not good.
So their interpretation now is that Tehran might be trying to, as they put it, take advantage of Washington's deal-making instincts again, maybe hoping to keep some capability, some knowledge, while still getting concessions. A repeat performance, potentially?
Okay, that's the diplomatic maneuvering. What about the actual science? What are the international watchdogs saying about Iran's nuclear activities right now?
Yeah, this is critical context, separate from the politics. International monitors are reporting that Iran is continuing to enrich uranium, and crucially, enriching it to near weapons level.
Near weapons level, that sounds serious.
It is. Both CBS and Reuters cite this, highlighting the technical progress Iran is making, even while the talks are stalled,
Well,
or maybe because the talks are stalled.
okay, near weapons level enrichment. What does that actually mean in practical terms?
Yeah.
How did the FDD experts frame Iran's current status?
Jonathan Sear in that CBN interview was pretty direct. He described Iran right now as a nuclear threshold state.
Threshold state, meaning
Yeah.
Meaning they've essentially done most of the hard work. They've got the material, maybe the know-how. They're right on the edge. They do have the capacity to move forward with a nuclear weapon pretty quickly if they decide to.
if they make the political call.
Exactly. And he added something even more worrying. He said that open source intelligence also shows that there has been efforts of weaponization.
Weaponization. So not just making the fuel, but figuring out how to build the actual bomb.
That's what it implies, yeah. Working on the technical steps to turn the enriched uranium into a deliverable weapon, not just the fissile material itself.
Wow, okay. So they're enriching to high levels, maybe working on weapon design. The talks are stalled. What kind of time frame are experts like FDD putting on this? Is there a deadline?
Sear gave a really stark timeline in that interview. He said, flat out, time is of essence when it comes to Iran, and 2025 has to be the year that the West, broadly Washington and Europe, make a decision on this issue.
2025, this year.
This year. He sees 2025 as the critical window. Either find a diplomatic fix now, or face the consequences of Iran getting much closer to, or maybe even achieving, a nuclear weapon capability. It adds a huge sense of urgency.
Okay, urgency is high, talks are stalled, Trump's pessimistic, Iran's making progress. Are the talks completely finished then? Is the diplomatic door shut?
Surprisingly, no. The sources confirm the channel is still open, even if it's really rocky.
Oh.
Yeah, it's noted that the 6th round of talks with the U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff is actually still scheduled to happen in the next few days.
6th round, okay.
And get this, Iran is apparently expected to present a counterproposal during these talks.
A counter-proposal. So they haven't walked away entirely.
Doesn't seem like it. So even with all the negativity and the huge disagreements, the formal process hasn't totally collapsed yet.
And through all this back and forth, the tensions, the progress, the pessimism, President Trump's ultimate red line hasn't changed.
Not according to his public statements in these sources. He's absolutely firm, keeps repeating the core message. We're not going to allow that, meaning Iran getting a nuke.
Right.
He hammered it home again. They can't have a nuclear weapon. Very simple. They can't have a nuclear weapon. That seems to be his non-negotiable bottom line, driving that demand for zero enrichment.
Okay. So that's the diplomatic side. Really tough, stalled talks, serious technical progress by Iran, expert warnings about time running out, but talks somehow still scheduled. Now, let's pivot to the other side of that convergence you mentioned, the military tensions. The U.S. personnel moves were also linked to that, right?
Directly linked.
Yeah.
And this is where the sources paint a picture that's, frankly, quite alarming. Right at this moment, with the nuclear talks faltering and Iran enriching, there are U.S. intelligence reports suggesting Israel is doing more than just talking.
What are they suggesting?
That Israel is actively making preparations for a potential strike against Iran's nuclear facilities.
Israeli preparations for a strike.
That's huge.
Oof.
What kind of preparations? Any specifics mentioned in the intel reports?
Yeah, according to CNN, intelligence sources familiar with the latest assessments have seen concrete signs.
Like what?
Things like movement of air munitions, getting bombs and missiles ready, likely for strike aircraft.
Okay. Moving weapons.
And also the completion of a specific air exercise, which could be interpreted as a rehearsal, a practice run for a strike mission.
And exercise completion.
Yeah.
Sounds like they're honing their plans.
And the CBS report put it even more starkly. They quoted U.S. officials who told them Israel is, quote, fully ready to launch an operation into Iran.
Fully ready. Wow. That sounds like they're just waiting for the go-ahead. But is everyone in the U.S. government convinced a strike is actually going to happen, or is it just readiness?
No, definitely not a consensus. And that's a really key nuance in the reports. The CNN source stressed that officials cautioned it's not clear that Israeli leaders had made a final decision to actually launch a strike.
So ready, but maybe no final decision yet. Right. And even more importantly, there's apparently deep disagreement within the U.S. government about the likelihood that Israel will ultimately act.
Deep disagreement. So some U.S. officials think it's likely, others don't.
Seems that way. The intelligence might show the capability. Is there planes ready, bombs ready? But the assessment of intent, whether Netanyahu would actually give the order, is apparently up for serious debate within the U.S. system.
And President Trump is reportedly trying to weigh in on that Israeli decision.
Yes, another significant layer here. Sources say Trump has spoken directly to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, telling him basically to cool it with the public talk about attacking Iran.
He told him to stop talking about it.
CNN reported Trump told Netanyahu to stop talk of an attack on Iran, and CBS added that Trump urged Netanyahu not to strike Iran, specifically while these negotiations are still technically happening.
Did Trump give a reason for telling Netanyahu to hold off?
He did. He's quoted saying he told Netanyahu a strike right now would be inappropriate because we're very close to a solution.
Interesting he say very close to a solution when he also expressed pessimism about the talks.
Yeah, it highlights the balancing act. Maybe trying to keep Netanyahu restrained by holding out hope for diplomacy, even if he personally has doubts. The main point seems to be, don't launch a strike while we're still talking. A unilateral Israeli attack could completely derail any remaining U.S. diplomatic efforts.
Okay, so we've got intel showing Israeli readiness, U.S. officials disagreeing on the likelihood, and Trump actively trying to pump the brakes on Netanyahu, at least publicly, during this diplomatic window. How's Iran responding to all this military talk and the risk of talks collapsing?
Iran's response has been sharp, issuing very direct, very clear warnings, especially aimed at the U.S.
Like what?
Iran's defense minister, Brigadier General Aziz Nasserzadeh, he put out a statement on Wednesday, same day as the U.S. personnel moves. He warned that if the nuclear talks fail and conflict breaks out, the U.S. would be forced to leave the region.
Forced to leave the region. That's not subtle.
Not at all. It's a direct threat, implying Iran would actively work to make the U.S. presence in the Middle East impossible if war starts over the nuclear program.
Did he say anything else?
He did. He added that in that scenario, the adversary will certainly suffer heavier casualties.
The adversary. Did he specify U.S. or Israel?
Sources say he didn't specify, but given the context threatening the U.S. leaving the region, the implication is certainly that engaging Iran militarily would come at a very high cost for whoever does it.
And did he mention specific targets? That relates directly to the U.S. personnel moves.
Yes, absolutely. He explicitly threatened U.S. military bases throughout the region.
All of them.
He was quoted by Iran's state news agency, IRNA, saying that if conflict erupts, all of its bases are within the reach of Iranian military, and they will not hesitate to target all of them in their host countries.
Wow. That's incredibly specific and escalatory. Targeting U.S. bases in places like Iraq, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, the very places we're talking about.
Exactly. It draws a direct line between a potential conflict over the nuclear issue and the safety of U.S. forces across the entire region. It makes this personnel adjustment seem very prudent in light of such direct threats.
Okay, so direct threats against bases. Did Iran say anything else? Maybe through diplomatic channels.
They use social media, too. Iran's mission to the UN posted on X, formerly Twitter.
What did they tweet?
They put out a statement saying, threats of overwhelming force won't change facts. Iran is not seeking a nuclear weapon, and U.S. militarism only fuels instability.
Overwhelming force. Was that responding to something specific?
According to Reuters, yeah. It looked like a direct reply to comments made by the head of U.S. Central Command, General Kurilla.
What did General Kurilla say?
He had apparently mentioned publicly that he was providing President Trump with a wide range of options to stop Iran from getting a nuke.
So Iran's tweet was pushing back against that talk of U.S. military options, calling it militarism, and repeating their official line that they aren't seeking nuclear weapons.
Exactly. Despite the enrichment reports and weaponization concerns we discussed, it's part of the public messaging battle alongside the military threats.
Okay, so the military situation is incredibly tense. You've got possible Israeli preparations, U.S. uncertainty about Israeli intent, Trump trying to restrain them, and Iran making very explicit threats against U.S. regional bases if things go south. How did those FDD experts in the CBN interview connect this back to the U.S. Embassy moves?
They saw a very direct link. Ahmad Sharawi, one of the experts, described the U.S. withdrawal measure as basically preventative.
Preventative.
Yeah. He pointed out it happened before this upcoming round of U.S.-Iran talks. He argued the move highlight worrying concerns over potential military escalation.
Okay.
And he specifically tied it to the Iranian threats we just discussed, saying it's especially concerning given that the Iranians have threatened to attack U.S. bases in the Gulf and in Iraq.
So in his view, the U.S. isn't necessarily reacting to a specific imminent attack, but more taking precautions because the overall situation is so volatile, especially with those direct Iranian threats on the table.
That seems to be his interpretation, yes. A prudent step before things potentially get worse, rather than waiting for something to happen. Hedging against miscalculation or escalation around the talks.
That makes sense. A preemptive safety measure.
Yeah.
And did the U.S. government itself indicate where they expect retaliation if things did escalate?
Yes, the CBS report mentioned this specifically. It stated the U.S. anticipates that Iran could retaliate on certain American sites in neighboring Iraq.
In Iraq specifically.
Yes, and that anticipation was part of the reasoning given for advising some Americans to leave the region. So it directly connects the broader Iran-Israel nuclear tension, the potential for military action, and the specific personnel moves in Iraq, seeing Iraq as a likely battleground for Iranian retaliation if, say, Israel were to strike Iran.
Okay, wow. So we've covered the immediate U.S. action-moving personnel. We'll dug into the drivers, the really difficult nuclear talks, Iran's progress, the enrichment, the weaponization fears, and then the military side. The reports of Israeli preparations, the direct Iranian threats against U.S. bases, all happening at the same time. It's a lot.
It really is a very complex and potentially dangerous mix.
So let's widen the lens a bit now. Look at the ripple effects, the broader context, starting with Iraq, since it's so central to these U.S. personnel moves.
Right. Iraq is in a uniquely tough spot here. As Reuters put it, Iraq is a rare regional partner of both the United States and its arch-regional foe, Iran.
Partner to both sides. That sounds like walking a tightrope.
An incredibly difficult one, especially when U.S.-Iran tensions flare up like this. You have, on one hand, 2,500 U.S. troops stationed in Iraq.
Right, advising Iraqi forces against ISIS.
But on the other hand, you have these powerful Tehran-backed armed groups, militias, that are deeply woven into Iraq's security forces and political system.
So Iran has significant influence inside the very structures the U.S. is trying to support.
Exactly. It creates this inherently unstable environment where loyalties are divided and external tensions can easily ignite internal problems.
And we've seen that happen before, haven't we? Especially after the Gaza war started last year.
Absolutely. The sources remind us tensions inside Iraq shot up after October 2023. Those Iran-aligned groups launched repeated attacks against U.S. troops and facilities in Iraq and Syria.
Have those attacks stopped?
The sources say the attacks have largely subsided since last year, which is good news. But the underlying situation, U.S. troops present, Iran-aligned groups present, and influential, hasn't fundamentally changed. That makes Iraq really vulnerable if the regional conflict heats up again.
And it's not just been proxy stuff. Israel and Iran have actually traded blows directly over Iraq before, right? Using Iraqi airspace.
Correct. Reuters mentions that specifically as important history. Just last year, Israel and Iran exchanged direct fire missiles, drones that apparently flew right across Iraqi airspace.
So Iraq literally becomes the corridor for their conflict.
Yeah, it's not just a theoretical risk. Iraq has physically been the space where direct confrontations between Iran and Israel have occurred. That really highlights its vulnerability.
Okay, so Iraq's in a tough spot. What about the bigger U.S. military picture in the region? Have there been other changes recently besides these personnel moves?
Yes. The sources note that in the months before these specific personnel withdrawals, the U.S. had actually increased its military presence in the Middle East.
Increased? How?
Reuters mentions deploying assets like B-2 stealth bombers temporarily, and also extending the deployment of a second aircraft carrier strike group in the region, although both of those specific assets have since rotated out or been replaced.
So a pattern of bolstering forces, sending deterrent signals maybe, even if specific deployments come and go.
Exactly. It suggests a backdrop of the U.S. trying to project strength and readiness in the face of these rising tensions, even as they now adjust personnel safety measures.
So it's not just people leaving. There's been a build-up context, too.
Yeah.
And these tensions, they don't just affect military bases and embassies, do they? They spill over into the economy, into shipping.
Oh, absolutely. Tangible effects. Reuters pointed out a direct economic hit. Oil prices jumped significantly right after the news broke about the Baghdad evacuation order.
How much did they jump?
Brent crude, the global benchmark, went up by $3 a barrel, hitting $69.18.
Wow, $3 just like that.
Yeah, it shows how sensitive global energy markets are. Any hint of instability in the Middle East, especially involving Iran, sends immediate jitters through the oil markets. Risk goes up, price goes up.
And shipping, too.
Yeah.
concerns about those vital waterways.
Definitely. On the same Wednesday these personnel moves happened, Britain's maritime agency put out a warning.
A warning about what?
They said the increased tensions could lead to more military activity impacting commercial shipping. They specifically advised ships to be cautious in the Gulf of Oman, and especially the Strait of Hormuz.
The Strait of Hormuz. That's critical, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where does Iran?
Hugely critical. A massive amount of the world's oil passes through that narrow strait. Any disruption there, or even the threat of disruption, has enormous consequences for global trade and energy security. That maritime warning is a direct result of these political and military tensions threatening global commerce.
Okay. Now, that CBN interview with the FTD experts, they also touched on some other related issues, didn't they?
Yeah.
Broader diplomatic stuff happening in the background that adds more context.
They did. They talked about the U.S. Israel relationship itself, which sounds a bit strained right now under these pressures.
Strained how?
Well, President Trump is reportedly pushing Netanyahu on two things: ending the war in Gaza, and also, as we discussed, stopping the public talk about hitting Iran.
Right.
The FDD experts, Sharawi and Sear, they noted that while the U.S. obviously still sees Israel as a key partner, these disagreements over Gaza, over Iran rhetoric, could potentially cause a big shift in the relationship if they're not resolved.
A big shift. Interesting. And Netanyahu's facing his own pressures, not just from Washington.
Absolutely. Jonathan Sear from FDD pointed out Netanyahu's got serious political trouble at home in Israel.
Domestic politics, how does that play in?
Sear suggested that if Netanyahu's government were to collapse due to these domestic issues, it might actually impact Israel's Gaza strategy more than anything else. Could even push Israel towards a diplomatic solution in Gaza sooner. It just adds another layer of complexity to Netanyahu's decision-making calculus while he's also juggling the Iran situation.
Right. Domestic pressure influencing foreign policy. What about other regional relationships? The experts mentioned something about Israel and Syria.
Yeah, Ahmad Sharawi brought up an Axios report suggesting Netanyahu had asked the Trump administration to help mediate talks with Syria's government, the Assad regime.
Talks with Assad? But didn't Israel call them terrorists?
Historically, yes. That's what makes it noteworthy. Sharawi suggested there might be some quiet diplomacy happening now, maybe behind the scenes.
Quiet diplomacy. Does that mean a peace deal could be on the horizon between Israel and Syria?
Sharawi was pretty skeptical about a full peace deal right now, called it a bit premature.
Why premature?
He thinks what's more likely is maybe some limited security coordination and deconfliction, especially in southern Syria near the Israeli border. The huge obstacle to real peace, he noted, is still the Golan Heights dispute. Israel holds it, Syria wants it back.
Got it. So maybe practical security talks, not full peace. And Jonathan Sear also had doubts.
Yeah, Sear questioned the stability and trustworthiness of the Syrian leadership, basically saying the overall situation is just too volatile for real normalization talks right now.
Okay, limited coordination maybe, but peace seems unlikely. And there was one other flashpoint mentioned briefly, the Houthis.
Right. The intro to that CBN interview mentioned Israel launching its first naval assault against the Iranian-backed Houthis.
In Yemen.
In Yemen, yeah. It just highlights another front where Iran-linked groups are active and facing direct military pushback, in this case from Israel. It adds another piece to this really interconnected web of regional tensions, all ultimately linking back to Iran in some way.
Okay. This has been incredibly detailed. Let's try to pull it all together. We started with the specific U.S. action, moving personnel out of places like Iraq and Bahrain.
Right. Ordered for some, voluntary for others.
The stated reason.
Yeah.
Rising regional tensions. But we saw the Iraqi counterpoint too. Then we dug into those tensions, primarily fueled by two things. First, the stalled nuclear talks with Iran, where enrichment is hitting near weapons levels and there are concerns about weaponization efforts.
That kind of talks are still scheduled somehow.
Right. And second, the military standoff. Reports of Israel prepping for a potential strike met with very explicit Iranian threats against U.S. bases if conflict breaks out.
A very dangerous dynamic.
Then we looked at the ripples. Iraq's difficult position, the recent U.S. military posture adjustments, the immediate hit to oil prices, the warnings to shipping.
And the related diplomatic complexities, the U.S.-Israel relationship strain, Netanyahu's domestic issues, the tentative Syria talks, the Houthi conflict.
All drawn from these sources, CNN, Reuters, CBS, that CBN interview.
Yeah, trying to synthesize what they're reporting.
So, putting it all together, this U.S. decision to move personnel, it's not happening in a vacuum, is it?
Not at all. It seems to be a direct, practical response by the U.S. government to what they perceive as a significantly increased risk level. a risk driven by that core standoff over Iran's nuclear program.
Which keeps advancing technically.
Right. And combined with the very real possibility of military conflict breaking out, whether initiated by Israel or escalating from miscalculation, or if talks completely collapse. And Iran has made it clear U.S. assets would be targets.
The sources really paint a picture of a moment that's incredibly delicate, don't they?
Absolutely. Balanced on a knife's edge, like you said earlier. You've got military options openly discussed, intelligence pointing to preparations, Iran issuing direct threats.
But diplomatic talks are still on the calendar.
But talks are still scheduled. It really feels like a race against time. Will there be some kind of diplomatic breakthrough, however improbable it might seem based on Trump's comments? Or will military action, or even just a mistake, push things over the edge first?
And this isn't just abstract geopolitics for people listening, is it? Why do these details matter to you, the listener?
No, definitely not abstract. It directly involves the safety of U.S. citizens, diplomats, military families serving overseas. That's a real concern. It impacts global stability in a critical region, which affects everyone. We saw the immediate hit to oil prices.
It affects your wallet.
And the warnings to shipping could affect global trade. Plus, fundamentally, it's about the huge challenge of trying to stop nuclear weapons spreading and the tough choices involved: diplomacy, sanctions, or force.
It really shows how connected everything is.
Yeah.
Moving people in Baghdad is linked to nuclear labs in Iran and potential military decisions in Israel. This moment really captures the bigger picture of Middle East volatility.
Exactly. This deep dive into what happened around June 11th, 2025, it's not just one incident. It's a snapshot in time of a much larger, ongoing, and potentially worsening situation. Multiple conflicts, multiple diplomatic tracks, all interacting in complex ways.
So as we wrap things up, we've taken this deep dive using the sources. We looked at the U.S. personnel departures from Iraq, Bahrain, and other spots driven by those rising regional tensions. We saw how those tensions stem from the deadlocked Iran nuclear talks, the enrichment, the weaponization worries, and the simultaneous military standoff, with potential Israeli strikes and definite Iranian threats against U.S. bases.
Right.
We also touched on the impact on Iraq, the wider U.S. military posture, the economic and shipping fallout, and those related diplomatic currents involving Israel, Syria, and the Houthis.
All pulled straight from that stack of articles and the interview transcript we had.
It's been a really fascinating, maybe a bit unsettling look at a critical situation unfolding right now. Okay, here's a final thought for you to mull over, based purely on what we've discussed from these sources. Given all these specifics, the U.S. saying tense, Iraq saying not here, the stalled talks but Iran's progress, the strike prep reports met by direct threats, and yet diplomats are still meeting what seems like the most likely immediate outcome. And which specific detail from these sources feels like the biggest driver pushing things in that direction right now?
Oh. And on that note, really appreciate you joining us for this deep dive into the source material.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Stay curious. Keep thinking about these complex issues.
Keep those questions coming.
Until next time, keep exploring.